All right, so Bill Conley over at ESPN, who does a lot of data stuff for the Four Letter Network, is calling Georgia's 2 year run the greatest of all time in college football history. And here's what he says, and we'll get right into it. He says, a recency bias, maybe, but in an era that demands more of its national champions, both teams, both in terms of heavy load, 15 games in a season, and elite opponents, 2 wins over top four teams at the end, Georgia still produced a better average scoring margin than any team on this list besides 94-95 Nebraska, 2000-2001 Miami, and 73-74 Oklahoma. The Dogs beat a total of 6 top 5 teams. And while they did lose a game, unlike Nebraska, they avenged that loss in the college football playoff. One other point in favor of Georgia here. Nebraska probably wasn't even the best team in 1994. The Huskers came up big in the clutch to win Tom Osborne's first title. Clutch to win Tom Osborne's first title was inspirational, but it wasn't the most dominant run ever. Georgia, on the other hand, was clearly the class of college football in both of its seasons until I changed my mind. I'm going with the Dogs. He had Nebraska 94-95 as number 2 and Alabama 2011-12 as his number 3. And having lived through both of those in a way that I can remember it very easily, um, so those Nebraska teams were exceptionally good. I think one issue with the Nebraska team at the time,
They did not uh, play an overwhelmingly complicated schedule. I'll tell you that right now. It just was not difficult to beat Nebraska. Um, Georgia, you can't really say that. That Georgia team this past season. I mean, obviously they played everybody in their way. Alabama was not the number one team in the country, but um, I don't I don't know how. Uh, you can say so Nebraska did do its best in the 90s to play games that were not Big Eight games. They played West Virginia and New Jersey. They played UCLA at home, and this is in '94. But man, it was just the Big Eight was not a great conference back then. They played two ranked teams the entire season. That was Kansas State and number two Colorado, which was a huge game. If you'll remember, Oklahoma was pretty bad back then. You probably don't remember that, but that's who they played. And then, of course, they beat Nebraska. Excuse me, Nebraska beat Miami by a field goal. I better remember the '95 and beyond Nebraska teams, which were just much more killers. That '95 Nebraska team was insane. I don't know if they played a close game. I'm not seeing one off the top of my head. I remember watching them a lot. They destroyed people. I mean, they destroyed people. Um, and doing all of that while running the option, that those guys were tough to deal with. But Tom Osborne, that everything caught up to them, and by the time they got to the Big 12, that did not suit their purposes as well. I mean, in '96 they lost to Arizona State. They got shocked by Arizona State. They lost to Texas in the essentially the college football playoff semifinals at the time, which was the Big 12 title game, and that was a shocking result. They lost to Texas. And then in '97, um, they went undefeated again, thumping people once more, but they had to win on the road at Missouri and all this stuff. Now, I'm getting kind of off the subject here, but that's who I would compare Georgia with the most is the '95, '97 Nebraska teams. The Alabama teams in 11 and 12, I mean, obviously those were exceptionally good teams. Kirby was the defensive coordinator at the time, but Alabama had to save themselves on more than one occasion in that run. In 2011, obviously they lost to LSU and didn't even play in the SEC championship game. Of course, that was Georgia. So they were very fortunate to get into the national championship game. They should have been there, I think, but they were fortunate to get in that position. In 12, had had one snap more gone Georgia's way, it would have been Georgia that won the national championship that year. They barely escaped LSU. They lost Texas A&M a week later, and then 32-28, probably one of the classic wins they've ever had. Alabama against Georgia in the SEC championship game in 2012. That was a huge, huge, huge game. Hey, make sure you're picking up Double Dogs, which talks about Georgia's national championship run here, 2 years in a row. If you do not get the book before midnight on Sunday night, you're not going to get the confetti. Okay, we have confetti from the game. If you're just watching this for the first time, make sure you pick up Double Dogs today. We're going to have some confetti. I'm just kind of dropping. I don't know what you'll get, but you will get confetti. This offer ends completely at 11:59 on Sunday night, the 29th. I don't know if we're going to run out, but I don't think we will. But it ends on the 29th. So that's it for that. Make sure that you are getting that today. Don't wait around. Um, when we look back at Georgia's run here, uh, it may prove to be more dominant than we thought. And here's why. I'm very more specifically, I'm talking about the 2022 season that we just saw Georgia complete. Someone's just ordered a book, which is smart of them. They'll get confetti. Folks in the present, they don't think about it the way that folks will over time. I mean, Georgia won the national championship game by the largest margin of any bowl game in history. I mean, they won the national championship, y'all, by 50 points. The game was not competitive in any way. There was no there was no scenario where after Georgia scored, this is my take. It was clear after the first quarter who was going to win the game. The question was by how much, and the answer was almost 60 points. So it's hard to it is hard to really explain that any better or further than that. I mean, they won that game 65-7. They nearly won the national championship by 60 points. I mean, they didn't beat Vanderbilt by as much as they beat TCU in that game. And it's not like they were running the score up. I mean, TCU just could not score at all. Now, over time, I don't know what that's going to mean. I remember the Miami Nebraska game in 2001, which should have never happened, but it did. And Miami just thoroughly stomped Nebraska back to the 1950s. I mean, it was bad. So, you know, I think you're going to see over time that what Georgia's done with this run here is really be one of the most dominant runs we've ever seen in college football history. That's what it will look like because, frankly, you just don't see a lot of back to backs. This one was pretty dominant. It was not as bad as this one, though. And when you think about the fact that Georgia played a number one team in the country and beat them by double digits. They beat the number three team in the country narrowly, or number four team, excuse me. They beat the number three team in the country by like by 57 points. You're just not going to see a lot of decisive games like that. National championship games have been pretty entertaining, generally speaking, in college football. Um, generally speaking, but what we saw the other night, about a month ago, not quite a month ago, that was a thumping, and I think that game alone, coupled with the Tennessee win, coupled with the way they beat LSU in the SEC championship game, the destruction of Oregon, South Carolina, everybody, and then the way that they had to win against Ohio State. I mean, the two games, Georgia's most competitive games this past 30 games have been a road win over Missouri, a loss to Alabama, and a 1-point win over Ohio State in Atlanta. Now, 2 of those were wins. So you have the one loss to Alabama, which was reconciled a couple of weeks later. Georgia has not lost to any, excuse me, Georgia has not failed to beat any team it's played lately in the last 30 games. So that's really saying something. The other thing, too, is, and in addition, you have of the last of the national champions since the football playoff began. Okay, think about it this way: since the college football playoff began, there's been a limited amount of champions. Ohio State, then Alabama, then Clemson, then LSU, and Georgia. Georgia defeated all 4 of those programs in this 2-year cycle. They beat Ohio State this year. They beat Alabama last year. They beat LSU this year. They beat Clemson this past year. I mean, I don't really know what else you're supposed to say.